Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in good spirits wherever you are in the world. And with that, I would very much like to share with you some thoughts about a film directed by the one, the only, John Carpenter. This is a film that was first shown in 2010. And as of now, this is John Carpenter's last directed film, as of now anyway. This is the film called The Ward. So as I say, this is, as of this particular video, the last film that John Carpenter has in terms of the films listed on his director filmography. So this was, as I say, first released in 2010, and this is a film, The Ward. Now, before I get into the particulars of this particular film, let me just say that I have here the Blu-ray, the Arc Entertainment Blu-ray, and this Blu-ray has the film, of course, and it has a 2-minute or so trailer to the film, and it also has a commentary track, an optional audio commentary track that features John Carpenter and Jared Harris. Now, Jared Harris plays a very pivotal role in this particular film, and so to have the two of them together talking on a commentary track is really delightful. As I've mentioned in past videos regarding the works directed by John Carpenter, having a John Carpenter audio commentary track for any film of his, any film or any TV series episode of his, is a true delight, because he is very warm, he is very giving in terms of his time, he asks questions, he always talks with a nice dose of honesty and modesty and earnestness when he's talking about the film and what is being portrayed on screen as the commentary is progressing. He also has a nice rapport with those that he has commentary tracks with, and this commentary track with the actor Jared Harris is no exception to that. I think the rapport between these two gentlemen is very rich, very fine, and quite engaging. And I like especially how they have a nice connection in terms of the types of films they really loved growing up. Jared Harris talks about his own family background, which is, of course, he comes from a very, his father is a very famous actor, and I think based off of his influence, according to Jared Harris, he was able to watch a lot of classical Hollywood films growing up, including many of the films that John Carpenter himself also really enjoys. For instance, westerns like John Ford westerns, Howard Hawks westerns, and so it's wonderful to hear these two gentlemen connect on that respect. And of course, they are talking about the particular film itself and the actors that are working on the screen and the characterizations and certain production details of the film itself. Although I must say that the commentary track does not 100% involve a conversation about the film and the production itself. So you're not necessarily going to get the entire production history details with respect to this film upon listening only to the commentary track. You will get some production detail history about certain actors that were on set, what the location shooting was versus the sets that were constructed and used, the nature of the low budget shooting of the film, certain limitations that John Carpenter had with respect to the filmmaking, working with some of the actors, John Carpenter's praise and Jared Harris's praise for some of the actors in particular. So you do get certain details like this, but in other parts of the commentary, you get conversations, really honest and I think organic conversations that arise between Jared Harris and John Carpenter regarding Jared Harris's acting career, acting on the stage in theater versus acting in front of a camera for a film, Jared Harris's acting method and his style and certain stories that he has about acting in general, and John Carpenter too, the way he approaches acting and the way he considers the craft, etc. And there's an interesting interplay between the two around the end of the commentary where Jared Harris asks John Carpenter what his opinion was about Assault on Precinct 13, the remake. So that's a pretty interesting thing, that little interesting bit of the commentary. Jared Harris also talks about how much he really admires and loves John Carpenter's films and how he first saw Assault on Precinct 13, the original film, in the theater. And so that was a real inspiration to him, according to what he says on the commentary track. And John Carpenter, in turn, also talks about his own background. And while he doesn't go into too many details about what he was doing in terms of his filmmaking during the 2000s or so, he does go into some details as to, for instance, why he doesn't do the music for this particular film like he did for other films. And it's a pretty practical reason that he cites. But he also talks about other aspects, both about this film and not about this film. So it's a pretty interesting mix of different sort of methods of commentary. That's not to say that the commentary track is completely irrelevant to the proceedings with respect to the film The War. As I was trying to suggest at the very outset, the commentary track does go into certain production details, and so it is to a certain degree relevant to the film, but it is also to another degree a wonderfully organic conversation between these two gentlemen, and in particular Jared Harris's acting method and style and stories that he brings to that, and also John Carpenter's method and style and stories that he brings to that as well. So it all comes together to combine in this one, I think, very good solid commentary track. And also Jared Harris and John Carpenter just have a really lovely rapport. It's nice to hear them talk. They're very friendly with each other. They have a nice, it's not just friendly, it's very friendly, in fact, and there's a mutual respect there as well. And so just to hear these two gentlemen talk about certain scenes of the film, and also how to depict horror, certain aspects of horror in this 2000s or 2010 when the film was released, certain aspects of how the horror genre has changed perhaps from when John Carpenter was arguably more active in the genre. And those sorts of things do come up. So I think it overall is a very effective, informative commentary track that is a nice mix of different types of commentary track methodology. So that's the commentary track, which is found on this particular Blu-ray that I have right here. This is from the US, by the way. But that's it as far as this particular film and this particular Blu-ray. Now, I don't know the history of this film and this release history of it on home media or physical media release. So there might be a better edition of this somewhere. I just don't know about it. But in any event, this is what I have. And at the very least, there is the commentary track. There isn't anything else on this Blu-ray. There is no making of featurette. There is no documentary. There is no interview with John Carpenter or anything like that. So we're just getting the commentary track, which is, I think, better than nothing. But I think even for a film like The Ward, because the involvement of John Carpenter and also many of the other actors, I think this has the potential for being a film that could be a really good, for instance, a collector's edition from a label like, say, Shout Factory, Scream Factory, or something like that. And I do think this film has the potential for getting a reevaluation. As I'll try to mention later, this film, I understand, has a pretty mixed to negative critical reception. And on the one hand, I can understand where that critical reception might be coming from. But on the other hand, I would suggest that there is a way, I think, of looking at this film in a very positive light. And also, I don't necessarily see this as being a bad film. I see this as being a pretty good film. Is it John Carpenter's best film? That is something to be determined, but it might not be. But even if it's not John Carpenter's absolute best film, I don't think it is a dud. I don't think it's a dud of a film. I think it does have certain strengths. And the reason why I bring that up now is because I think this type of film, and in particular because John Carpenter directed it, I think this type of film is very much perfect for a collector's edition or special edition release from a label like Shout Factory or Scream Factory or Arrow or something, with some extra added features, documentaries and interviews, etc. Again, to give the opportunity for a critical reassessment, which I think might come. This is still a rather recent film. This is 2010 after all. This is now, this particular video that I'm making is 2020, so it's about 10 years since this film was initially shown in a theater. And so there might still be time for this film to grow in stature, but I think a healthy, a fairly packed release of this film would be very helpful. But that's not to say that the commentary track is not helpful at all. It is very helpful and it is very entertaining. So at the very least, try to find a copy of this if you are looking for it. Try to find a copy of it with the commentary track, if not more, if you can find it. So with that, my friends, that is my general impressions of this release and of the film in general, without going into too many spoilers. But now what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about the film in detail. So if you haven't seen the film The Ward and you are interested in John Carpenter's works, I think this is a film that is certainly worth watching. Once again, it is a film that I think has a lot of positive strengths to it, which I will try to address later on in this video. But in any case, my friends, if you haven't seen the film yet, I suggest that you stop this video now. Try to watch the film. It's not very long. It's only about 90 minutes, so it goes by very quickly. And then you can come back at any time, at which point it'll be my pleasure to hear your thoughts about this interesting film from John Carpenter. This is The Ward. Okay, so you're back, which means we can now talk in detail about this film, The Ward. So this is a film that is credited as being written by Michael Rasmussen and Sean Rasmussen, and we have Jeroen Orbach as the director of photography, and we have Mark Killian credited as being in charge of the music, and we have John Carpenter directing. So I think we have, in a sense, John Carpenter not necessarily being involved, at least in terms of the script itself. At least that's my impression and understanding. And so this might be seen as being a work where John Carpenter is being a director for hire. So there might be questions going forward as to the extent to which John Carpenter's actual footprint can be felt in this particular film, or is it just a standard fare horror thriller of a genre or vein that, to be perfectly honest, we have seen before in other similar types of films. So it's really up to you and how you particularly view this work from John Carpenter. And I can see both sides being expressed with equal vigor. And perhaps the latter viewpoint, perhaps suggesting maybe a negative viewpoint of this film, which I can completely appreciate and I can respect. However, I think, as I mentioned earlier, that this film is far from being a dud. I would say it's a good film. Is it the best John Carpenter film? I will say right now that it is not what I consider to be the best directed John Carpenter film on the face of the planet. But it doesn't need to be an entertaining suspense horror film. a psychological horror film. And I think this is what this film is. And I think it is quite entertaining. And I'll try to explain why. So first of all, I think in the context of John Carpenter's filmography, we have seen, up to now, John Carpenter dealing with the concept of horror or threat or menace or violence that oftentimes, or perhaps almost always, comes from some kind of external force or external stimuli that is turning something from the outside. It's turning something potentially evil or infecting something or taking something over. So we've seen this idea of the external forces taking over or taking control, or the external forces attacking the internal. We've seen this throughout John Carpenter's works, from Assault on Precinct 13, Halloween, The Fog, Prince of Darkness, They Live, In the Mouth of Madness even, Village of the Damned. We've seen it also in Ghosts of Mars. We've seen it also in countless other films. And so this is to say that up to now, the landscape, the tableau of horror that has been painted, or horror or menace that has been painted by the brushstrokes of John Carpenter's direction, has generally been a depiction of the externalities affecting the internal. And of course, this does result in a kind of internal paranoia struggle or dissection of the human condition, I think made most brilliantly in the film like The Thing, for instance. So externality, the external infecting nature of an outer space being, creating the stimuli or the catalyst for the idea of an internal grown paranoia from within, and who to trust, etc. So there, of course, is the idea that even in a John Carpenter film, we do get internalized paranoia horror. We do get that, of course, but it always seems to be connected with, or as the result of, some kind of externalized horror. That's the point that I wanted to make, up to now anyway. But with this film, The Ward, I would suggest that we have John Carpenter at a very unique and a different point in terms of the narrative, because the nature of the narrative is that for the first time we are dealing almost exclusively with a kind of horror or menace that is internalized within the character or the mind of this particular individual that we are talking about. We think that the main character is Kristen, but in fact we realize that she is but one personality of a number of different personalities that have that are now occupying the psyche of the character we understand later to be Alice. And so this is an interesting thing. In other words, the landscape or tableau of the horror at the subject, at the heart of this particular film, is in essence the internalized mind of this particular character that we later learn is Alice. And so I find this exploration, the psychological horror exploration, to be actually very, very interesting in the context of John Carpenter's cinematic universe. Now, is it purely internalized exploration? Of course not, because we do understand from the background given as to this particular character's plight, why she ended up becoming the way she did. We understand that she was imprisoned in a particular house for a certain period of time, and that caused some kind of something to occur in her mind and her heart to therefore essentially create these different personalities, which then become the focus of the direct narrative of the film. So I do understand that this kind of the creation of the personalities, let's put it that way, did come about through some kind of externalized evil or externalized menace, which came from this very ambiguously presented part of the narrative, which was her backstory about why she ended up becoming how she was, because of how she was bound in the basement of this particular house, and that sort of thing. And so there is a kind of external reason for the internalized horror that we see. I understand that, but I think the point that I was trying to make is that the focus of the film is less on this externalized horror element of the backstory, but almost entirely on the internalized psychological horror landscape that we see before us, and these different personalities that we understand are different personalities of the same being much later in the film going forward. So in that sense, I find this to be a very unique turn in John Carpenter's horror, psychological suspense landscape, because once again it is less of a focus on the externalized horror and almost entirely a focus on the internalized psychological landscape that gives rise to this horror or unease or violence, if you will. And the violence comes, of course, in terms of the demon or the figure of the disfigured Alice, and how she is hunting down each personality one by one within the context of this particular ward or hospital in the 1960s. And so this is the essential conceit of the film. And I do find, therefore, that it is, in many senses of the term, a kind of different direction in the kind of narratives that we've seen John Carpenter tackle before. We've also never seen, I think, in a John Carpenter film, a film that's dealing almost exclusively with this idea of in terms of the multiple personalities, this idea of a wholly subjective experience. In other words, the film is in essence a kind of representation from the viewpoint of the many personalities. We think it's from the viewpoint of Kristen, the Amber Heard character, but in fact it's the expression of all these personalities from the viewpoint of this character. And so in many ways, this film is a very subjective experience from this character's point of view, because we see these characters interact in the space and time, but we don't realize that this is all in her head until the final moments of the film and the reveal at the end. And so up to that point, this is a very subjective experience type of presentation. And I don't think we've necessarily seen this extent of that in past John Carpenter films. We have seen, of course, the subjective experience expressed very effectively, I think, in terms of the, for instance, the POV camera, the moving camera that we saw from films like Halloween, for instance. We also see the subjective approach and how the camera depicts the objective viewpoint and then the subjective viewpoint, and exchanges is an interchange between the two viewpoints in a film like, say, Memoirs of an Invisible Man. And we also see the changing shifts of perspective and reality versus illusion in films like In the Mouth of Madness, etc., etc. And so I don't want to suggest that we have never seen any kind of subjective point of view depicted in a John Carpenter film in the past. No, on the contrary, we really have. But I would suggest here that there is a real emphasis on this subjective viewpoint, much more so than in other films. And sure, there's a trick to that here, in the sense that we are not meant, I suppose, to know that it is a subjective viewpoint until the final twist of the film. So perhaps there is that something of that will add a little bit of complexity to that particular analysis that I'm trying to bring. But be that as it may, I think once we realize what's going on and we rewatch the film, we can understand that this is indeed a sort of subjective viewpoint. There are certain ways in which the film goes along with this subjective point of view. For instance, some of the scenes involving the Jared Harris character, the doctor, when he is seemingly talking with all of the different women in one room, and he's looking from place to place, seemingly talking to different people at the same time. But rather we understand that this is in fact the doctor talking with the one woman who has the many different personalities, but we see it from the viewpoint of that which has all the personalities, but looks as those personalities as different entities. And so that is a subjective viewpoint, but we don't necessarily appreciate that it is a subjective viewpoint until we understand what the denouement is, and then upon rewatch. But the film does play along with that. And then Jared Harris, we see him moving his head, talking here, talking there, as though he is talking to different people. So the film does lend itself to that kind of interpretation. So it helps that interpretation along the way. Let me put it that way. But I do think it is a kind of, maybe not a turning point, but it is a different direction than what we have seen thus far in John Carpenter's filmography. So I find that very interesting. But there are also ties to a kind of cinematic tradition or cinematic past that I think do exist. Whether they were intentional or not, I can't be sure. But in terms of visual style, there are certain cinematic traditions. We have seen John Carpenter work with films dealing with cinematic traditions of the past, classical Hollywood traditions, for example, westerns, sci-fi, romance, etc., film noir. We've seen that in the past. I would say here we have a certain mystery element going on. There is almost a kind of Agatha Christie type of thing going on with each of the characters, and one by one they are essentially offed, and we have to figure out what the source of the mystery is, etc. And there is some kind of demon or monster figure in this particular hospital or ward. So that has a certain element of mystery or horror that might be said to be akin to a cinematic tradition of the past. I would also say, even more specifically, this whole idea of a depiction of the ward and the corridors inside reminds me a lot, actually, of Shock Corridor, the film Shock Corridor, the Samuel Fuller film. And so, and I would actually say with that visual comparison, there also comes perhaps a thematic or narrative comparison that can be made as well. When we think that both films, in their own respective ways, can be seen to be some kind of exploration as to the psychological terrain of these particular characters and how they are dealing with external pressures, etc., and how they internalize them. And I think each film, it does it in a slightly different approach, of course, but I think each film can be said to be, in terms of a comparative analysis, dealing with a similar type of thrust of examination in the form of the narrative that each film respectively takes. So there is a kind of visual comparison and also thematic comparison that can be made to a film like Shock Corridor, which therefore is maybe, whether on purpose or not, is still a connection that can be reasonably made between this film and the cinematic traditions of the past, which is, again, something that we've seen time and time again in all of John Carpenter's works. And so it's lovely to see that kind of interplay in John Carpenter's filmography still alive and well in a film like The Ward. And I should say that also, I think that there is also a sense of maybe that the performances might. I understand that maybe one of the subjects of criticism of the film sometimes was the nature of the performances themselves, and in particular maybe the young women in this particular story. But actually it really fits into the narrative of the film when we remember that they are all personalities of one particular woman who had a very traumatic experience when she was younger. And so I think we can therefore understand and maybe even forgive the fact that if we even see these performances as being maybe simplified, let me put it that way, I think that simplification is on purpose, and I think it's essentially meant to represent that they are different representations of the same young woman individual. And so I think there is nothing wrong with the fact that we might have quote-unquote simplified performances. In fact, I think that's what gives it a nice strength and flavor, because we are also dealing with the interactions between and among young women who are just that. They are young women. They are here in this particular facility, and throughout the film we don't exactly know what their situations are, but we know that they are in this facility. Of course we know what the truth is going forward, but until that denouement twist ending, we understand that they are interacting among each other. And what I like about those scenes, very much so, is it reminds me a lot of, for example, the rapport that we saw between and among the young women characters that we saw in John Carpenter's film, Deborah Hill, John Carpenter film, Halloween, and the relationship between the high school girls in that film. And we see a large chunk of that film with essentially just the girls talking with each other. Maybe they're walking along the street talking, they're on the phone with each other, they're talking about high school stuff, they're talking about books, they're talking about boys, they're talking about all these other things, and dances and all this stuff. So it's all this sort of quote unquote regular stuff, and they act somewhat childishly at some points, which also adds to a certain charm of their characterizations and their interactions among each other. And I think that's one of the strengths of that particular film, Halloween, because it humanizes the characters and thus makes what ends up happening to them throughout the course of the film all the more terrifying. And I would say also that a similar kind of interplay could be said to be at work here among the female protagonists, the female characters that we see here. The Kristen character is talking with the other women here. So Iris, Sarah, Emily, and Zoe. There's also one other woman named Tammy, but as you know, we see what happens to her at the very start of the film. So we see the rest of these women sort of interacting, and some perhaps more than others. In particular, we see a lot of interaction between, say, Kristen and Iris, or Kristen and Emily, etc. But what I like about this interplay and these relationships is that there is a kind of sense that these are young teenagers. They aren't necessary, and they're sort of enclosed or really trapped in this particular facility. And so I like how there's a kind of sense of young teenager rapport that exists among these women, which is not unlike that rapport which we saw in the earlier John Carpenter film, Deborah Hill film, Halloween. There is even a sort of physical resemblance between Laurie Strode and Kristen in this film, and so I like that sort of even physical resemblance, which is pretty interesting. Which is to say that I admire the fact that we are getting a real, almost how should I put it, a film that might not necessarily seem to be a film that is a sort of teenage angst film or teenage comedy film or teenage drama film, but I think in many ways it is, and I really admire the film for it, and therefore I can how should I put it? I can forgive the film. I don't even want to use that word, but for lack of a better word, I can forgive the film if I were to assume the position that these performances are somewhat maybe simple or somewhat two-dimensional. I don't think so. I mean, because of the fact that they are aspects of the same particular character, I can understand the way in which they're being presented, but also I can understand this presentation based on the fact, as I was trying to suggest now, that these are like teenage girls just talking with each other. And I think this particular aspect comes alive very, very nicely in that moment when they're playing the record and it's just playing the song Run Baby Run, the new beats, and I think that song and the way that they are dancing, and this is the moment too where the Kristen character, it's one of the only times in the film I think where we actually see her smiling, and so that moment when they're just letting loose and doing dances, which I also really admire because there's a certain sense of character to each of the dance moves that each of the actors gives to their particular character. So if you look, the dance moves almost are reflective of the types of characters that they are. So I like how they're not all the same, but they're all sort of individualized, and I really find these details to be very fascinating. And this moment, therefore, is a kind of liberating moment, or it's just a moment where the girls can just be who they are. And that is, as I was trying to suggest earlier, very much in line with this idea of trying to tell a story that is in essence about girls and the relationships that they have between each other or among each other, which is something very similar to what we have seen in past John Carpenter works such as Halloween. And so I think this film does have a really strong, or potentially strong, through line anyway. Now, the film also is a horror film, and it does have a monster at the heart of its horror film, and it does have this monster who essentially kills these girls one at a time, and sometimes we see it on screen, not all the time, but sometimes we do see it on screen, and some occasions in particular it's quite violent. For instance, the death of for example, Sarah with the electroshock therapy machine device, which is very, very disturbing. There's some blood that we see, and there's some makeup appliance achieved, but it's more or less to do with the way that the actors portray it, and also the sound effects and the needle as it registers higher and higher voltage, and the lights going up and down, etc. And then, which is very, very disturbing. We also get other scenes involving knives and that sort of thing, and so that's also very disturbing. And I think the commentary, the Jared Harris, John Carpenter commentary, made reference to the fact that maybe some critics of the film saw these horror scenes as being akin to kind of what's the phrase? It's sort of the very extreme horror that we saw in the 2000s or the mid 2010s or something like that. And while I can see that kind of viewpoint, I would also suggest that in fact what we do actually see on screen is there's a lot of violence, don't get me wrong, but it is still of a kind of violence that I would say is not necessarily of the kind that we might see in sort of excessive, extreme horror of that particular subgenre from this particular time. And so there's a lot that we actually are confronted with that is left very much to the imaginations of the audience members, the viewers. And so there is an argument to be made that this is not, in essence, a part of that extreme horror genre. It might look it, it might feel it, especially in the contemporary times, but there's the argument, I think, a very reasonable one to be made, that this is not of that same cloth. But it is still shot very effectively, and we do see also quick editing, or not quick editing, I should take that back, but effective editing, which I think we have come to know from John Carpenter's works, both past and present. So there's that. Also, there's the monster itself, the Alice monster, and we understand that there was a kind of backstory involving the girls before Kristen came into the picture, and trying to basically get rid of Alice, and a sort of conspiracy that all the women were involved, etc. I do admit, though, that in past John Carpenter films, the films were always very good in establishing a set of criteria, a set of rules, a kind of physics as to how the monsters operate, what it is they do, how they affect their victims, and how do we stop the monster. There was always a certain clear path in terms of the presentation of information, the way that the physics of the universe worked, and how, therefore, to stop the particular monster, the antagonist of that film. Here in this film, I would suggest that that kind of presentation of information is probably not so clear, in the sense that it's not necessarily clearly delineated as to exactly how these girls were able to get away with essentially getting rid of Alice when it obviously still happened in the context of this particular facility. So that is never really explained. It's never explained also how this monstrous specter figure tends to float around and move about from room to room to room, almost in a supernatural way. We're not necessarily given those details as to why this being has supernatural powers, and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, we realize by the film's end that all this withholding of that information that we probably would have otherwise seen in a past John Carpenter film was for the effect of the surprise ending, right? And so it was necessary to preserve the surprise ending. In order to preserve that, we needed to, or the filmmakers probably needed to, withhold certain bits of information, which meant that we didn't necessarily get a clear delineation as to the physics of this world, why this specter has the powers that it has, how can it float, or how can it go from one place to the other, etc. We never got that sense of perspective as presented in this film. Again, it was on purpose, I'm sure, in order to preserve the surprise of the ending, but still, we never get that. And so we're always left wondering exactly how this universe is meant to operate. How does this monster go from here to here? What is it about this monster that makes it vulnerable? Why is it exactly that when the axe is shoved into the monster, it's just, why is that the way to kill the monster? We never got a sense of the monster being corporeal. Or of the flesh. We always thought of it almost as being almost spectre-like or ghost-like in terms of the way that even the scales or the skin and the veins seem to move on the surface of the skin and that sort of thing, or how the beings seem to just suddenly appear from behind you, where that wouldn't have made sense in the real world of physics, etc. So there was always a sense that maybe it was a real being, or not a real, that it wasn't a real being, but that it was in fact a ghostly spectre. But then suddenly, how can it have flesh and bones and blood to bleed and ultimately die? That is never clear. And so, but of course, we realize that this is all part of the inner psychological workings of this one particular character, Alice. And so, therefore, once we get that information, we can understand exactly why there is a sort of ambiguous tone to the presentation of the information, and also why there is an ambiguous tone to the presentation of the monster itself, because the larger picture is in fact what the larger picture is. So that is, I think, a pretty interesting way to see the film. And therefore, there is an argument to be made that I think the film perhaps works better on rewatch than it does on initial view. Of course, there is the impact of the surprise on initial view, but I think on rewatch, the film gains a little bit of stature or steam, at least potentially anyway, because we now realize the way in which the filmmakers are trying to create this illusion of a non-subjective presentation of the film, whereas it is in fact a subjective presentation of the film, and also how the film is trying to present this idea of a monster loose in a haunted house, basically. But in fact, the whole point of the film is not the haunted house, but the whole point is the horror from within, which is being depicted here. The haunted house monster element is almost like a metaphor that I think becomes less and less significant as one rewatches the film. In other words, the more one rewatches it, at least the more I rewatch it, the more I can realize that it's more about the inner workings of this particular character and the multiple personalities at play, rather than the monster element, although the monster element is still important, which is therefore to say, however, that I do think this film can survive, and I think it can survive a critical reappraisal, and I think it deserves a critical reappraisal, if for anything, because there are some really, really good elements to it. I also mentioned the idea of links back to Halloween. I think the character, the Jared Harris character, Dr. Stringer, I think that character is a really strong character in the context of John Carpenter's filmography. He reminds me a lot of, for instance, the doctor characters that we saw, for instance, Christopher Reeve's character in Village of the Damned, and others. But I think also there's an interesting parallel. It's not perfect, but there is an interesting parallel also that can be made, for instance, with Donald Pleasance in Halloween, Loomis. And so there is an interesting connectivity that can be said there. But I think all in all, there's also a nice sense of earnestness to the character. One of the interesting things about the commentary that Jared Harris brings up is that oftentimes in let's say Hollywood films, is oftentimes the case that English actors or actors with English accents often are cast as the villains of action spectacle films, etc. And so Jared Harris in this film keeps his accent. He doesn't try to turn it into a U.S. accent or an American accent. At least I don't think so. So that's an interesting choice, because according to the commentary, that actually lent itself very nicely to the fact that maybe he might be considered the villain. Maybe people might guess him to be the villain, and so he becomes almost like a red herring, which is very interesting, especially when we consider how his character turns out in the end. It's a very earnest, positive character, and one that I think is really trying to help this particular patient of his to work out the issues that she has in the context of her internalized psychological terrain. Of course, there are certain issues, of course, and the commentary, I think, brings them up in a very almost comedic way. For instance, the way that the end plays itself out, and essentially the Kristen character and the Alice character essentially fight, and they throw themselves out the window, and we realize that this is actually Alice herself falling through the window. The people on the commentary actually make the point that this is actually a maybe not such a good way for the doctor to cure his patients, to allow them to essentially fling themselves through windows and fall to the ground below. But that little detail aside, and it's acknowledged by the filmmakers themselves, so it's an interesting little quirky part of one of the details of the underlying story, perhaps. But be that as it may, I still think that the Jared Harris character, Dr. Stringer, has a very positive aspect to his personality and his function in the narrative, thus making him, I think, a very memorable or potentially memorable character in the pantheon of John Carpenter's films. Not to mention, of course, the other characters that we see in this film as they play out. So I do think that there is much room for reassessment of this film, and while I do understand that there are some people, maybe a lot of people perhaps, who might view this film in a mixed to negative light, I do think that there is possibility with this. Again, even at the end of that reassessment, one can still dislike it and then move on and never watch this film again. That's perfectly fine. But there is still room for reassessment. I'll certainly admit that. And also, I do think that because this film falls at the very end of John Carpenter's filmography, director filmography, at least as we know it now, that might put somewhat of an unfair pressure on the film itself, maybe because it feels like the end of the run, or maybe it feels like the final statement of John Carpenter's directorial career, or something to that effect. And so maybe it feels in that sense like a letdown. I would suggest also that a film like this, maybe if it came in the context of many other films that were made around the same era, then maybe it would be seen with less negativity or less mixed results, because there would have been other films around it to bring more attention to the John Carpenter filmography of the 2000s or something like that. But the fact that this comes in the 2000s, when we saw relatively little output from John Carpenter, at least compared to the 1980s, that's for sure, right? Because in the 2000s we only saw Ghosts of Mars, and we also only saw the Masters of Horror series episodes, and then this. So maybe because of the relative lack of overall output from John Carpenter's directorial efforts anyway, maybe this might seem more conspicuous. And because of its increased conspicuous nature, maybe there's more attention called to the fact of its weaknesses rather than its strengths. And I can certainly see that viewpoint coming up. But at the same time, I must return to what I was trying to suggest in this video, namely that while I acknowledge that there are the viewpoints of viewers of this film that might suggest that this is not one of John Carpenter's stronger efforts, there are still positive ways to view this film, and there are still positive ways to view this film in the context of John Carpenter's career and also as a film itself. And I think those potentially positive aspects, I think, are enough to at least call for a critical reassessment of this film, which hopefully will come very soon. I don't know exactly when it will come, but maybe it will come one day when a label like Shout or Scream Factory decide to release it, if at all, on a nice collector's edition or something of that nature, to create a complete John Carpenter set or something like that, which I think is very important, once again, because I do think that this film has its place. It has a rightful place in John Carpenter's filmography, and it's trying to do different things while also harkening back to a lot of the same styles and trends and concerns that John Carpenter as a filmmaker was concerned with in the past. And so I think that interesting tension between trying to do something new and trying to stick with traditions that we've seen work in the past, I think that tension is something that makes this film very interesting. And that tension also is what I would suggest as being one of potentially many elements that can be subject of a potentially positive reassessment and reappraisal. There is a lot of good things here. Again, it's not my favorite John Carpenter film, but there are a lot of good things here. And as I mentioned at the outset, this is not a bad film. I don't think this is a bad film at all. I do think it is doing a lot of interesting things, and I hope I made myself clear on those. Again, I don't expect a lot of people to agree with everything that I've said here, but then again, films I know are subjective, and so if you have a different view than what I've been trying to express here, I have no issue with that, my friends. I think your views are just as legitimate and valid, so please feel free to share them in the comment section below if you want to, and I'd be very happy to listen. But let me now just say as a conclusion that now it's May 2020, and so as of now we don't have any more John Carpenter directed films or TV series or anything like that to explore. So this is the end. This is the end of the journey, and I must say that it has been a very fun and enjoyable ride, and I'm so glad, my friends, I'm so glad that you decided to join me, and we could take this journey together, because I really enjoy your company, and I really enjoy the works of John Carpenter. So having those two together really made this a lot of fun. It really made it worth it. There will be one more video to conclude this particular journey, this process that I had the great pleasure of engaging in, and that will come very soon, my friends. And that will be a summing up of my overall impressions of this particular series, as well as a ranking. I will try to rank my personal John Carpenter films ranking list, including my very, very, very #1 favorite John Carpenter directed film. So that'll all be in the next and final video of this particular series. But until then, my friends, I hope you have enjoyed. I hope you have enjoyed the works of John Carpenter as well. If you have been visiting them for the first time, I hope you enjoyed them. And I look forward to our continuing conversations, my friends, going forward with respect to this or to any other John Carpenter film that you want to talk about. Because if you do want to talk about a John Carpenter film, I am always game, my friends. I am always game. He's one of my favorites. So with that, my friends, let me end it there. And until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you once again for your time, and cheers.